Shalom. I'm Messianic Pastor Michael Brown, and I want to welcome you to Session 5 of this series, Messiah Yeshua's Life, a Messianic Jewish Perspective based on a harmony of the Gospels. We're going to start looking at paragraph 3 in both books, which is the genealogy of the King. So we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 17, and Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. Now, instead of taking time to read through these two genealogies, which involve quite a number of names, I trust that you have or will read through them yourselves. But please have your Bibles open to these passages, or you can have the book open where it has the scriptures in there, because I'm going to be referring to them during this teaching. Please note that we see genealogies and birth narratives only in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, so we don't see those in Mark and John. Now, when we look at the birth narrative of Yeshua in Matthew, we read of angels speaking to Joseph, which is the Hebrew for Joseph, in dreams, and what Joseph was thinking, maybe thinking about, well, what's he going to do with his wife, or Miriam, who's pregnant, what he's planning to do. But there is no mention in the Gospel of Matthew of such things happening to Miriam, which is the Hebrew for Mary. In other words, what she's thinking. There's no talk about angels talking to her or dreams or anything. It's all Joseph. So since the focus in Matthew has been on Joseph, it's reasonable to conclude that Matthew's genealogy of Yeshua would be Yeshua's genealogy through Joseph. A.T. Robertson points out an additional support of this in Matthew 1 verse 16 when it says Yaakov or Jacob was the father of Joseph, and it says begot or the father of was consistent throughout the genealogy and shows that the genealogy has gone down to Joseph and then Yeshua. So Joseph is the adopted father of Yeshua, since Yeshua was not his biological son. Also, this makes sense that this, again, is Joseph's genealogy, because Matthew would give the legal descent of Yeshua, since he wrote chiefly to our Jewish people, and that would have been something that was very important to them. Now, when we look at the birth narrative in the Gospel of Luke, we read of the angel Gabriel, or that's Hebrew for Gabriel, speaking to Miriam, which is the Hebrew for Mary, and Miriam praising God, and her going to Elisheva, which is Hebrew for Elizabeth, and her proclaiming blessing on Miriam, and then there's mention of what Miriam was thinking. So again, the focus is all on Miriam. There's no mention of such things happening in the Gospel of Luke happening with Joseph. So since, again, the focus in this case is on Miriam, it's reasonable to conclude that the genealogy of Yeshua there in Luke chapter 3 was Miriam's genealogy, even though it never explicitly states that. A.T. Robertson, as well as Dr. Fruchtenbaum, point out that in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, it mentions son there in the English translation. If you look down, all the names in Luke's genealogy, if you look at the Greek, have a Greek genitive definitive article in front of them. It's actually two is what it is. And in the Greek, that is meaning of, or in this case, son of. Well, that two occurs with all of them except one name in that list of genealogy, and that's Joseph. So that indicates Joseph is different than the rest of them down through that genealogy where it says, was so-and-so was the son of. So that indicates Joseph is not part of the genealogy list like the other names, but instead is part of a parenthetical idea there at the beginning. Now, what do I mean by that? In other words, if you look in the English, you'll see there in verse 23, it says, being supposedly the son of Joseph. So that's what I mean. It's kind of a parenthetical thought. So in Luke chapter 3, verse 23, the beginning of the genealogy, it really is saying in English, Yeshua himself was about 30 years old, being son, and then it's kind of in parentheses, as was supposed of Joseph, and then close the parentheses of Eli. Now, some English translations say Heli, but it's really Eli. All right, so in Jewish thought, son can mean son or grandson or a descendant of. So think of it in those terms here. So what he's saying there is, since Yeshua had Luke's already mentioned about a virgin birth, so no one should think Yeshua was the physical descendant of Joseph or any other man. Thus, Yeshua was really Eli's, even though we translate it son, but really grandson, which is allowed by this Greek construction here. So Eli, as best we know, was really Miriam's father. So Yeshua was physically born of Miriam or Mary, and was therefore grandson of Miriam's father Eli. So that's what it's basically saying there in the genealogy. Now, since Luke was writing especially for Romans, but really for all people, he gave the biological genealogy for Yeshua. Women were normally never mentioned in Jewish genealogies back then. But sometimes a woman's husband was substituted for her in that genealogy. So that's apparently the case here. That's why he mentions supposedly of Joseph, because Joseph is really substituting in there for Miriam in verse 23. Now, in the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament, here's just an example here. There's two passages dealing with the same situation, where a woman's lineage was traced by the name of her husband. Let me give you the example. The example is in Nehemiah chapter 7, verse 63. It's also in Ezra 2, verse 61. It's the same thing there, both cases. But listen to what it says in Nehemiah 7, verse 63. It says, the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was named after them. All right, so in this case, the man, him and his descendants were named after his wife's descendants. But that's an exceptional situation. So I'm just using that as the example where here the husband is substituting for the wife in that case. Dr. Fruchtenbaum mentions in his book that someone he references says there are two passages in the Talmud which speak of a Miriam or Mary, daughter of Eli, which he says, or this person says, according to Jewish scholars, could refer to Yeshua's mother. Now, let me just say that I tried to verify that. I have been unable to find any Talmudic reference for that is correct. I've looked on the internet. There's some that are floating around out there, and when you check them out, they're not correct. I even read where a Jewish rabbi disputed that the Talmud ever mentioned Miriam, daughter of Eli. So I don't know if that is correct. But again, if it is, I'd love to get the Talmudic reference and verify it's correct. Now, let me interject that occasionally you will find people who will argue that Luke's genealogy is not Miriam's, which is what I'm advocating and Dr. Fruchtenbaum is advocating, but they will instead say Joseph's. They'll say that both in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, both of those are genealogies for Joseph. The church historian Eusebius advocated this. Now, the way that they try to explain that these two genealogies, which are not identical, how they explain they could both apply to him, is they say that the Yaakov or Jacob in Matthew 1, verses 15 through 16, and the Eli or Heli in Luke 3, verse 23, they say those two people were brothers or half-brothers, and one of them died, and the other brother did Levirate marriage. In other words, he married his deceased brother's widow to try to raise up descendants for his deceased brother. So one of them in this case was really Joseph's natural father, and the other was his legal father. Now, for that to be possible, Matthon in Matthew 1 verse 15 and Mathat in Luke 3 verse 24, which look very similar in the English and the Hebrew, would have had to have been the same person and be the father of Eli and Jacob. But I only mention that just in case you come across that on the internet or you hear somebody mention it. But I believe, Dr. Fruchtenbaum believes, that Luke's genealogy is of Miriam. It's not also of Joseph. Even though, like I said, it never explicitly says it's Miriam's genealogy, but I believe that's the best explanation. Now, just comparing these two genealogies in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, I want to point out some things. For one thing, we see that Matthew's genealogy, it goes down. In other words, so-and-so begot so-and-so down the line. But Luke's does it in reverse order. In other words, it says so-and-so was the son of. So it's like going at the bottom, going up. Matthew's genealogy is taken not just from King David, but from Abraham or Abraham all the way down to Yeshua. But Luke's genealogy, again, it goes in reverse order, goes up, all the way up from Miriam / Joseph. Again, Joseph is substituted there for Miriam, up through her father, Eli, and then on up the line till it eventually goes up through David and then Abraham, and then it continues and goes all the way up to Adam and then up to God. Now, in Luke's genealogy, from Abraham up to Adam, it's the same as is given in the Hebrew Scriptures in Bereshit or Genesis, except Luke has included a person named Canaan, and he is substituted there in Luke chapter 3 between Arphaxad and Shelah. Okay, now if you look in Bereshit or Genesis chapter 11 verses 12 through 13 where Arphaxad and Shelah are mentioned, it says Shelah was the son of Arphaxad. But according to Luke chapter 3, we see there actually was Canaan between the two of them. Now you say, well, where in the world is Luke getting Canaan from? He's getting it from the Septuagint or Greek translation of Genesis chapter 11 verses 12 through 13. There Canaan is mentioned. So I believe that's indicating in the original Hebrew for Bereshit, Canaan was in there between those two, and somehow the Masoretic text which we have today, maybe you'd say a scribal mistake somewhere in copies, somehow Canaan got left out. Now let me mention some other observations. Both genealogies are the same from Abraham down to King David, but the genealogies from King David down to Yeshua are different. Matthew's goes down through David's son Shlomo or Solomon. Luke's genealogy, though, goes down through David's son Nathan, or Nathan in English, and now this is not the same Nathan the prophet that ministered to King David, but maybe this son of David was named after him. Matthew has 27 generations from David to Joseph, whereas Luke has 42 generations. All right, so that indicates Matthew's leaving out probably some people, and that's what I'm going to be mentioning in a few minutes. Matthew's genealogy goes through the kings of Judah. Luke's doesn't go through the kings. In other words, once you get below David, there's no mention of kings of Israel or Judah. Matthew's genealogy mentions 4 females, whereas Luke's doesn't mention any females. Now, Matthew's mentioning of females in the genealogy, that was against the Jewish norm, which normally only mentioned men in genealogies. Luke's is more typical of genealogies in the scriptures, again, not mentioning any women, and he doesn't appear to intentionally skip any names like Matthew ended up doing. Dr. Fruchtenbaum points out Luke ends his genealogy with Adam or Adam, thus drawing attention to Yeshua's humanity. Matthew's and Luke's genealogies contain 4 of the many titles of the Messiah. In Matthew chapter 1 verse 1, Yeshua is called the son of David. He's also called the son of Abraham or Abraham. In Luke chapter 3 verse 38, he's called the son of Adam. And then he's called and the son of God. Each title emphasizes a different aspect of his person and his work. As the son of David, Yeshua is a king of the Davidic line. As the son of Abraham, he is a Jew. As the son of Adam, he's a human. And as the son of God, he's deity. He is God. Now these 4 titles portray the Messiah Yeshua as the Jewish God-man king. Furthermore, by calling the Messiah the son of Abraham, he's connected with one of the 4 eternal covenants God made with Israel, namely the Abrahamic covenant. And by calling him the son of David, that connected him with the Davidic covenant. Again, an important covenant, saying again that the Messiah, the kings over Judah, over Israel, were going to be descendants of King David. Another observation. Both genealogies mention a Zerubbabel son of Shealtiel. But let me just say, I believe once you analyze it, it's clear they're not the same people. So it's not the same Zerubbabel and Shealtiel in those 2 genealogies. They just happen to have the same names. Actually, Zerubbabel and Shealtiel, those were common names back then. The Zerubbabel in Matthew's genealogy is the well-known Zerubbabel. In other words, the one that led the Babylonian captives back to Israel, or at least those that went with him. Let me say it's possible that the Zerubbabel and Shealtiel in Luke's genealogy were named, again these are different people, but they were named after the well-known Zerubbabel and Shealtiel. As possible support for this fact, and it doesn't prove it, I'm just saying as possible support, in Matthew's gospel, there was only 10 successive people or generations from Zerubbabel to Joseph. But in Luke's gospel, that Zerubbabel was 19 people or successive generations away from Miriam and Joseph. Now we know, again we know, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, Matthew has left out some people out of his genealogy, but that's a lot of people to be leaving out. So what I'm saying is, just looking at the genealogies and where Zerubbabel and Shealtiel show up, it seems likely these are different people. Another support for these being different people is that in the 1st century, when they still had the genealogical records in the temple before it was destroyed in AD 70, no one complained or said, not even Yeshua's opponents, that these 2 genealogies didn't match up or they had mistakes. In other words, the opponents never questioned that, so they were considered to be accurate. Now, in regard to the well-known Zerubbabel in Matthew 1 verse 12, there it says that his father was Shealtiel. But if you look in 1 Chronicles 3 verses 17 through 19, there it states Zerubbabel was a nephew of Shealtiel. King Jehoiachin, who was also called Jeconiah, I'll talk about him a little bit later, is the father. It's there in that passage in 1 Chronicles 3. It says that Jeconiah is the father of Shealtiel and his brother Pedaiah, and then Pedaiah is listed as the father of Zerubbabel. All right, so let me just say 1 or 2 things is possible here. In the manuscripts that we have today of 1 Chronicles, it's possible there could have been a scribal error in those. Again, not in the original First Chronicles. I'm just talking about copies where a mistake could have gotten in there. But it's another possibility is that Shealtiel really died childless, and therefore Pedaiah, his brother, married Shealtiel's widow and carried out what was called Levirate marriage to raise up an heir for Shealtiel in accordance with Devarim or Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 6. So, like I said, that's probably likely what it was, unless it was a scribal error. Therefore, Zerubbabel was the legal son of Shealtiel, as shown in Matthew chapter 1, but he really was the biological son of Pedaiah, as it was shown there in 1 Chronicles chapter 3. Now let me further comment on just Matthew's genealogy. Notice in Matthew chapter 1 verse 1, he begins with the record of the genealogy of. That's in the English. Now the Greek word translated genealogy there in Matthew chapter 1 is the Greek word Genesis, and it means beginning, origin, genealogy. Now it's interesting that if you go to the book of Bereshit, which in English is called Genesis, 11 times in the book of Bereshit or Genesis, it mentions the generations of or the account of. Now there in the Hebrew, it's a Hebrew word toledot, and that helps us to see the different sections of the book of Bereshit or Genesis. Now the Septuagint, which was again a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, in the Septuagint of Bereshit or Genesis, when they came across toledot, they used the Greek word Genesis. And that's actually what led to the English name of that Bible book being Genesis. It came from that Greek word Genesis that was used 11 times in the Septuagint version of Bereshit. So I point all that out just to say this. So we see that the book of Matthew begins talking about the generations of a genealogy, and Bereshit or Genesis uses the same Greek word in the Septuagint version, Genesis. So both are involving generations of or genealogies. So it's just a similarity between the two. Matthew's genealogy is said to be divided into 3 groups of 14 generations or 14 individuals. Look at Matthew 1 verse 17. It says, so all the generations, from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. Now, to achieve this, we know that Matthew had to intentionally leave out some names in the genealogy so that it would divide evenly into 3 sections of 14 generations. For example, in verse 5, he left out some unnamed descendants between Solomon, who lived around 1400 BC, and Boaz, who lived around 1120 BC. So that was, 380 years difference. So we know that there's some people that Matthew chose for his own purposes. And again, this is not a mistake. It's not an error. I mentioned about this at the beginning of this series. He just was doing that for his purpose and what he was trying to present. Also, we know Matthew left out between Joram and Uzziah, who's also called Azariah, in verse 8. He left out, we know this from we know this from Kings and Chronicles. He left out Ahaziah, who reigned only for 1 year, Joash, who reigned for 41 years, and Amaziah, who reigned for 29 years. So he left those out there in verse 8 in Matthew chapter 1. Also, he left out Jehoiakim in verse 11. Let me mention one other thing. In 1 Chronicles 3:19 through 24, it doesn't list any Abihud, who Matthew mentions in verse 13 of Matthew 1 verse 13. So that means either Abihud isn't listed there in that genealogy in 1 Chronicles, or he has another name which is listed there. Matthew's genealogy only lists 41 people. So he had to count David in both the first group and the second group to get the 14 generations. Also, at the end of the second group, he doesn't count Yechanyahu, who's in English Jeconiah, since he was ending that group with the Babylonian captivity, not the person, but only counts Yechanyahu in the third group of 14 and ends that group with counting Yeshua. So Luke has 55 people for that same part of the genealogy, but again, he's trying to do it down, and he only has 41 people in Matthew. Now, you may say, well, why in the world did Matthew do this? Well, 14 is the numeric equivalent of David. See, you can in Hebrew, you take each of the Hebrew letters, and that can represent a number. So like Aleph represents 1, Beit represents 2. All right, if you take the Hebrew name for David, which is David, there's 3 Hebrew consonants there. There's a Dalet, that's the 4th Hebrew letter, so that represents the number 4. The Vav, that's the 6th Hebrew letter, so that represents the number 6. And the final Dalet represents 4 again. So here you got to do a little math here. If you add 4 to 6 and 4, what do you get? 14. So that's the numeric equivalent for David. So for his Jewish audience, Matthew focused on the key figure, David, because the Messiah was known to be a son of David. Notice in verse 1, he didn't say son of Abraham, son of David, which would have been the chronological order of them, because David lived after Abraham. But instead, what Matthew did intentionally, he reversed the names to focus on David, to emphasize David. He says the genealogy of Yeshua, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Dr. Fruchtenbaum points out that Matthew employed a common midrashic method of mnemonics. Mnemonics just means something to help you remember it. And he gave an example in his book. It was the Talmudic tractate Avot, that means fathers, 5 verses 2 through 3. There they do the same kind of thing that Matthew did. There they divide up a genealogy into 10 generations, different groups of 10. So again, this method was for them in ancient times to help them remember them. I mentioned earlier that Matthew listed the names of 4 women in his genealogy. He mentioned Tamar in Matthew 1 verse 3. He mentioned Rachav, that's the Hebrew for Rahab, in Matthew 1 verse 5. He mentioned Ruth, which is the Hebrew for Ruth, in Matthew 1 verse 5. And then in verse 6, he just mentions her, and we know that her is referring to Bathsheba. Now, the original New American Standard Version, they actually put the word Bathsheba in there because they know that's who it's referring to. But Bathsheba was not in the Greek, so it just says her there in the original Greek. Normally, I've said this before, women were not mentioned in Jewish genealogies, but in the Hebrew Bible there were some exceptions, so sometimes they were mentioned. Though these 4 women were not unimportant, they don't appear to be the most significant women in the ancestry of Yeshua. For example, we don't see any mention of Sarah, or Rivka, which is Hebrew for Rebecca, or again Rachel for Rachel, who were far more important. But he probably listed these four women because they were Gentiles. Tamar and Rahab were Canaanites, and Ruth was a Moabitess. Bathsheba was probably a Hittite. Matthew probably included these four Gentiles in Yeshua's ancestry to show that God had a plan for Gentiles too, just like the Jewish people. And the Messiah didn't come just for the Jewish people, but for all people. God loves the nations and wants to use anyone who follows him. I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to pick up next time with this. So again, we're going to continue with paragraph 3 next time. So I hope you'll join us for that. God bless you.